Hi class. Today we are going to start talking about the blood, and blood is a fluid connective tissue. So I want you to remember what are the three basic components of connective tissue. Remember the monkey jungle? Yes, the three basic components are fibers, cells, and ground substance, right? In blood, the ground substance is fluid and it's called plasma. So that's a ground substance. There are different types of blood cells present in the blood. We have white blood cells, red blood cells that we will talk about. And blood also has some dissolved fibers that help to form clot. So blood is rightly called a fluid connective tissue. Now, the temperature of blood is actually 1 degree higher than the body temperature. It's about 38 degrees Celsius. And also remember that blood is actually more viscous than water because it has so many things dissolved in it. Some basic functions of blood. Blood helps in transportation of many things. Blood transports oxygen, carbon dioxide. Blood also transports nutrients to different cells of the body. Blood carries waste from different cells of the body and takes it to the urinary system. Blood also transports hormones and other important ions. Regulation. Blood helps to regulate a lot of things. It helps to regulate temperature. It helps to regulate pH and also composition of body fluid. Now, how is that done? Well, blood, as we exercise, the heat is absorbed by the blood, and that helps us to maintain body temperature. So if the body so plasma absorbs and distributes heat throughout the body. If the body needs to be cooled, the blood vessels in the dermis dilate and dissipate the excess heat through the integument. Conversely, when the body needs to conserve heat, the dermal blood vessels constrict by vasoconstriction, and the warm blood is shunted to deeper blood vessels in the body. This helps us to retain heat. Blood also regulates blood pH. The term pH means how acidic or alkaline a fluid is. A neutral pH is measured exactly at 7, whereas acidic fluids range between 0 to 7 and alkaline fluids range between 7 to 14. So blood plasma actually contains ions and compounds that may be distributed to fluid bathing cells within the tissues. And know that the pH of blood plasma is slightly alkaline, and the blood pH is maintained between 7.35 to 7.45. So blood has a very narrow pH range, 7.35 to 7.45. As we did talk about this before, if the pH drops below 7.35, we go into metabolic acidosis. If it goes above 7.45, we go into metabolic alkalosis. And blood has a buffering system. It's called the bicarbonate buffering system that helps the blood to maintain pH. All right, there are specific proteins in blood called albumin that regulates fluid volume within the blood vessel, and it also regulates how much of the fluid will escape into the interstitial space. So that is regulated by the albumin, which is a specific protein in blood. There are white blood cells that help in immune response. There are different types of white blood cells that we will talk about, and the white blood cells, they produce antibodies against foreign antigens, not our own antigens, but against foreign antigens. So what is blood made up of? So if you take a sample of blood from a patient, as you see in this picture, so you take blood, fill it in a test tube, and you spin it down for, let's say, 3 minutes. After, or in this picture, it says 10 minutes. Okay, do it for 10 minutes then. After you spin it down, you will see that there is separation of materials. At the very bottom, you'll have the heavier red blood cells, and in the middle you will have a little buffy coat, and the clear straw colored plasma will be on top. So if you look at a blood, about 55% of the whole blood is plasma, and about 44% of blood volume is erythrocytes or red blood cells. We have about 1% of leukocytes and platelets. So these are the three basic components of blood. You have erythrocytes, plasma, and then leukocytes and platelets making up the buffy coat. I want you to understand one thing here. Platelets, they are not real cells. They are cell fragments, and platelets come from, actually, they're fragments of larger cells called megakaryocytes. Megakaryocytes. So from these larger cells, we have the platelets, and they are cell fragments. All right, so I'll show you a picture that I usually draw out in class on the whiteboard. I just tried to draw it on my surface and give you a flavor of how it looks like in a regular classroom. So here, looking at blood. Blood has about 55% plasma and 45% formed elements. Now the formed elements have, I'll just draw quickly here. There are erythrocytes or RBCs that are about 44%, and then there is platelets and white blood cells. And white blood cells that make up about 1% of the formed elements. So that's formed elements. And then we have a lot of plasma. Plasma is about 55% of the total blood volume, and about 92% plasma is pure water. And there are about 7% plasma proteins. There are 4 types of plasma proteins that we will talk about. Those are albumin, globulin, fibrinogen, and regulatory proteins. Albumin is about 58% of blood plasma proteins. Remember, albumin is the smallest and the most abundant plasma protein. It's the smallest and most abundant plasma protein. Albumin regulates osmotic force of blood, therefore it regulates how much fluid will remain within the blood vessels, and also regulates how much fluid will escape out into the interstitial space. Albumin also helps in transportation of hormones and other ions in blood. Okay, hold on. Okay, then moving on to globulin. And globulin is the second largest plasma protein. We have about 37% of plasma protein is globulin, as you see here. There are 3 different types of globulins: alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha and beta globulins transport hormones and ions. And the gamma globulin, those are the ones that actually produce antibodies against foreign antigens. The third plasma protein is fibrinogen. We have about 4% fibrinogen in plasma, and fibrinogen plays an essential role in clot formation. And the fourth one is other regulatory proteins, and they just hang out in blood as enzymes and hormones. So these are the 4 main types of plasma proteins. All right. How do we remember this? Remember, a good friend remembers. A for albumin, good globulin, friend fibrinogen, remembers regulatory protein. So a good friend remembers. And you will get some detail-oriented questions from this slide. So I can ask you questions like, okay, which is the smallest and the most abundant Plasma protein. Which plasma protein makes antibodies? Which plasma protein helps to regulate blood osmotic force? Questions like this. So whatever is written down here, everything is important, and I expect you to go over all these. Okay, so now zooming into the formed elements. The formed elements, as I mentioned before, is made up of erythrocytes or red blood cells, about 44%, and then platelets and white blood cells make up about 1% of the formed elements. Now, if we look at the white blood cells, they are grouped into two main categories. We have granulocytes and agranulocytes. Together, they make up the white blood cells. I should draw it out here. So the granulocytes and agranulocytes, together, they make up the white blood cells. Now, granulocytes, as the name indicates, these cells have granules in their cytoplasm, and when stained with specific dyes, the granules are very, very prominent and visible. That's why they are called granulocytes. The agranulocytes, on the other hand, they do not show the granules. That doesn't mean that they don't have granules. They have granules, but they are small, so they are not very clear after staining. Okay, so I want you to know this. Both granulocytes and agranulocytes, they have the organelles. However, in case of granulocytes, they pick up the stain and they are very, very prominent, which is not the case in case of agranulocytes. Okay, the first granulocyte we will we will talk about is neutrophil. If you see here, I have drawn out a neutrophil for you. Remember, a neutrophil has a 3 to 5 lobes of the nucleus. If you look at the nucleus, it's 3 to 5 lobes of the nucleus in case of neutrophil. Neutrophil fights bacterial infections mostly, and it has some pinkish or reddish type of granules in the cytoplasm. That's all you need to know about neutrophil. Moving on to the next type of granulocyte called basophil. Basophil, as you see here, it has a bilobed nucleus. So nucleus has 2 lobes. Basophil has dark blue nucleus. Can you remember this? Dark blue granules. So basophil has blue granules. Basophil has blue granules. And basophil produce histamine that causes inflammation. The third one is eosinophil. Eosinophil, like basophil, also has bilobed nucleus. However, it has red or pink or purplish granules in the cytoplasm. Eosinophil fights parasitic infections and it kills parasites in blood. That's all you need to know about neutrophil, basophil, and eosinophil. When it comes to your textbook is pretty detailed, explaining and talking about the different types of granulocytes and agranulocytes. But for testing purpose, I highly recommend that you really stick to the PowerPoint and my notes here. Okay. Moving on to agranulocytes, remember they do have organelles in their cytoplasm, but they are not very well stained. Therefore, it seems like they have no granules. There are 2 types we need to talk about, lymphocyte and monocyte. And I'll start with a new video talking about lymphocyte and monocyte.